Most Americans believe that turning 40 is the moment to become more conservative with their investments. They reduce stock exposure, increase cash holdings, and shift towards safer assets. On the surface, this feels responsible. In reality, for many people, this single shift becomes the most expensive investment mistake they will ever make. The problem is not that people after 40 start thinking about risk. The problem is how they define risk and what they ignore in the process. At this stage of life, income is often at or near its peak. Careers are established, expenses are high, and retirement suddenly feels closer. Many investors assume that the biggest danger now is market volatility. So they respond by lowering exposure to growth assets and prioritizing stability. They believe they are protecting what they've built. What they often miss is that at 40, time is still a powerful asset, but it is no longer unlimited. A typical 40-year-old has 20 to 25 years before retirement. That is not a short-term horizon. It is long enough for compounding to matter significantly. Yet many people behave as if they are 5 years away from retirement, not 20. Here is where the logic breaks down. By reducing growth too early, investors lock in a lower return profile at the exact moment when their accumulated capital could be working hardest. The effect is not dramatic in the first few years, which is why the mistake goes unnoticed. Consider a simple comparison. An investor at 40 has $250,000 invested and contributes $12,000 per year. If the portfolio earns an average annual return of 6%, it grows to roughly $1.2 million by age 65. If the same investor shifts to a conservative allocation earning 3%, the result is closer to $750,000. The difference, about $450,000, is not caused by income, discipline, or luck. It comes almost entirely from one structural decision: lowering growth too early. Most people believe they are de-risking. In reality, they are exchanging short-term volatility risk for long-term shortfall risk. This risk is harder to feel because it shows up later when options are limited and adjustments are costly. Another factor makes this mistake even more common. Advice, standard rules of thumb like reduce risk as you age or protect capital after 40, are often applied mechanically without context. They rarely account for individual timelines, savings rates, or the difference between market risk and goal risk. Avoiding temporary losses feels prudent. Failing to reach long-term goals does not feel real until it is. Inflation amplifies the problem. A portfolio that appears stable in nominal terms may still lose purchasing power over time. For someone in their 40s, this means future retirement expenses become harder to meet even if the account balance grows slowly. The most dangerous part of this mistake is that it feels correct. It aligns with caution, responsibility, and common advice. There is no obvious warning sign, no immediate penalty, just a quiet reduction in future flexibility. Before discussing solutions, it is essential to clearly see this pattern. The issue is not that Americans after 40 stop investing, it is that many of them stop investing effectively at the exact point where structure and long-term thinking matter most. To understand why this mistake is so common after 40, it helps to look at how people's financial lives change structurally at this stage. The issue is not ignorance. It is a combination of income patterns, behavioral pressure, and the absence of a clear investment system. First, income structure shifts. For many Americans, earnings peak between 40 and 55. At the same time, fixed expenses are high: mortgages, education costs, healthcare, family support. Because so much of life feels financially locked in, investors become more sensitive to losses. A 15% market decline at 30 feels recoverable. At 45, it feels threatening, even if the math still supports recovery over time. This sensitivity leads to behavioral compression. People start optimizing for emotional comfort rather than long-term outcomes. They hold more cash, tilt portfolios toward bonds, or move into conservative target date funds earlier than planned. None of these actions are irrational on their own. The problem is that they are often taken without reevaluating the full timeline. Consider a realistic scenario. A 42-year-old household has $400,000 invested and saves $15,000 per year. Concerned about volatility, they reduce equity exposure from 70% to 40%. The portfolio becomes calmer. Year to year swings shrink, but the long term return expectation also drops. Over 20 years, the difference between a 6% and a 4% return on this structure is substantial. At 6%, the portfolio may reach around $1.4 million. At 4%, it ends closer to $1.0 million. The household did not become reckless or irresponsible. They simply optimized for short term comfort without recalculating long term needs. The second driver is the absence of a system. Many investors after 40 operate with fragments: a 401k, a brokerage account, some cash, maybe a rollover IRA. Each piece was added at a different time for a different reason. What's missing is a unified rule set that defines how much risk is needed, where it should live, and how it changes over time. Without a system, people rely on rules of thumb. Dial back risk after 40. Protect capital. You can't afford a big loss now. These statements sound reasonable, but they are incomplete. They don't account for savings rate, retirement age, or how much growth is mathematically required to fund future spending. Standard advice also tends to focus on age rather than objectives. Two 45-year-olds can have radically different needs. One may be fully funded and able to reduce growth. Another may still require strong returns to close a gap. Applying the same conservative adjustment to both produces very different outcomes. There is also a misunderstanding of what risk actually is. Volatility is visible. Shortfall risk is not. Markets going down feel dangerous. Not meeting retirement income needs feels abstract because the feedback is delayed. Investors respond to the wrong signal. Finally, advice often ignores contribution power. In the 40s and early 50s, people often have their highest saving capacity. Reducing growth exposure at the same time that contributions peak weakens the combined effect of savings and compounding. The system loses momentum precisely when it should be strongest. This deeper view makes the pattern clear. The mistake after 40 is not caution, it is unguided caution. Without a system that ties risk to time, goals, and contribution strength, investors follow advice that feels prudent but quietly undermines long-term outcomes. After 40, the investment mistakes most Americans make are not dramatic or reckless. They are subtle, structural, and repeated consistently. Because they do not cause immediate damage, they are rarely questioned. Over time, however, they compound into meaningful financial shortfalls. The first major mistake is reducing growth exposure too early. Many investors assume that lower volatility automatically means lower risk. As a result, they shift heavily into bonds, cash, or conservative target date funds long before retirement is near. This reduces short-term fluctuations but also lowers expected returns at a critical stage. To see the impact, consider two investors who are both 45 years old, each with $500,000 invested and contributing $20,000 per year until age 65. Investor A maintains a growth-oriented allocation and earns an average annual return of 6%. Investor B shifts to a conservative allocation and earns 3.5%. After 20 years, Investor A ends with roughly $1.9 million. Investor B ends with about $1.3 million. The $600,000 gap is not caused by income differences or savings discipline. It comes from one decision: lowering growth too early. The second mistake is overestimating the danger of short-term losses while underestimating the danger of long-term insufficiency. A market decline of 20% feels alarming, even though recovery over a 15-20-year horizon is historically common. Running out of money later in life feels distant and abstract, so it receives less attention. This leads investors to protect against the wrong risk. The third mistake is relying on age-based rules instead of math. Advice like reduce risk after 40 ignores how much capital is already saved, how much is still needed, and how long the money must last. For many households, retirement may last 25 to 30 years. That means a 45-year-old investor may still need growth for 40 to 50 years total. Applying conservative rules too early increases the likelihood of falling short. Another common error is assuming higher income will compensate for lower returns. In practice, income helps only if it is converted into productive capital. A household earning $150,000 that invests conservatively can underperform a household earning $90,000 that maintains a balanced, growth capable portfolio. Returns apply to the entire accumulated balance. Income applies only to new contributions. There is also a sequencing issue. In the 40s and early 50s, contribution capacity is often at its highest. This is when compounding works most efficiently because new money and existing capital grow together. Reducing growth exposure during this phase weakens both effects simultaneously. Over 5 years, these mistakes appear minor. The portfolio feels calmer. Over 10 years, the gap becomes noticeable. Over 20 years, it becomes defining. At that point, fixing the problem requires either much higher savings, delayed retirement, or reduced spending expectations. The critical insight is that this outcome is not caused by market conditions or bad luck. It is caused by decisions that prioritize short-term comfort over long-term sufficiency. The issue is not that Americans after 40 stop being disciplined. It is that many of them apply caution without a framework. Understanding these mistakes is essential before moving to solutions. The goal is not to take more risk blindly, but to avoid reducing growth in a way that quietly guarantees future limitations. The solution to this problem is not to ignore risk after 40, but to redefine how risk is managed. Instead of reducing growth blindly, the goal is to align investment structure with time horizon, contribution strength, and future spending needs. This requires a system, not a reaction. The first step is to separate volatility risk from shortfall risk. Volatility risk is the chance that markets decline temporarily. Shortfall risk is the chance that long-term returns are insufficient to fund retirement. After 40, many investors focus almost exclusively on the first and ignore the second. A functional system addresses both at the same time. Practically, this means maintaining meaningful exposure to growth assets while controlling how that exposure behaves during market stress. For most everyday investors, this starts with a core allocation to diversified equities. These are not speculative positions. They are broad market holdings designed to capture long-term economic growth. Over multi-decade periods, equities have historically outpaced inflation and cash, which is essential for retirement funding. The stabilizing element comes from structure, not from abandoning growth. Instead of drastically lowering equity exposure, stability is introduced through diversification and segmentation. High-quality bonds, for example, can reduce overall portfolio swings without eliminating growth. Cash reserves serve a specific role, funding short-term needs and providing flexibility, not replacing long-term assets. Mechanically, this system works through predefined rules. One common approach is to set a target allocation range rather than a fixed number. For example, an investor may decide that equity exposure should remain between 55% and 70% through their 40s and early 50s, gradually adjusting only as retirement approaches. This avoids sudden shifts driven by market fear. Another key mechanic is rebalancing. When markets rise and equities exceed the target range, a portion is trimmed and moved into stabilizing assets. When markets fall and equity exposure drops below the range, new contributions are directed toward growth assets. This process enforces discipline without requiring predictions about market direction. Contribution strategy matters as well. After 40, savings rates often peak. Maintaining growth exposure while contributions are strong significantly improves long-term outcomes. New money entering the portfolio during market downturns benefits from lower prices, while existing assets compound over time. This combination is powerful and often underestimated. This system is stable because it does not rely on forecasting. It does not assume specific returns, interest rate paths, or economic scenarios. Instead, it assumes uncertainty and is designed to function across different environments. Growth assets handle long-term needs. Stabilizing assets manage variability. Cash covers near-term obligations. Importantly, this approach does not increase risk blindly. Risk is controlled through diversification, time horizon matching, and clear limits. The investor knows how much volatility is acceptable and why it exists. There is no need for frequent changes, only periodic review. The result is a structure that preserves flexibility. If markets perform well, the investor benefits from growth. If markets struggle, the system provides time and liquidity to avoid forced decisions. After 40, this balance is critical. Stability comes not from avoiding growth, but from using it intentionally within a system designed for long-term sufficiency. When the earlier parts are combined, the pattern becomes clear. The most common investment mistake Americans make after 40 is not a lack of effort or discipline. It is the absence of a structure that connects time horizon, contribution power, and required long-term growth. Once this is addressed, the problem becomes manageable. The system itself is straightforward. It starts by defining three roles for capital. The first role is short-term stability, cash and near-cash assets that cover 1 to 2 years of essential expenses. This layer exists to absorb shocks and reduce pressure during market downturns. It is not designed to generate returns. The second role is long-term growth. This portion of the portfolio remains invested in diversified equity assets. The size of this allocation is not determined by age alone, but by how much growth is mathematically required to reach future spending needs. For many investors in their 40s and early 50s, this means maintaining meaningful equity exposure rather than reducing it prematurely. The third role is stabilization. This includes assets that dampen volatility, such as high-quality bonds. These assets reduce the need to sell growth investments at unfavorable times. They do not replace equities, they support them. What changes over time is not the structure, but the outcome. After 1 year, the primary difference is behavioral. The investor experiences less pressure to react to market movements because short-term needs are already funded. Investment decisions follow rules rather than headlines. After 5 years, the difference becomes visible in the numbers. Growth assets have time to compound, while stabilizing assets limit drawdowns. The portfolio grows more consistently, and progress toward long-term goals becomes measurable rather than speculative. After 10 years, the impact is decisive. Investors who reduced growth too early often face limited options, higher savings, delayed retirement, or lower spending. Investors who maintained a balanced, growth-capable structure typically retain flexibility. They can adjust risk gradually without compromising the entire plan. The practical steps to implement this system are clear. First, calculate essential annual expenses and define the cash buffer required to cover them. Second, review current investments and assign each to one of the three roles. This often reveals that growth was reduced without necessity. Third, establish allocation ranges instead of fixed targets, allowing for controlled movement rather than abrupt changes. Fourth, rebalance periodically and increase growth exposure through new contributions when markets decline. This approach does not rely on optimistic assumptions or market timing. It is designed to function across different economic environments. Risk is not eliminated, but it is directed where it serves a purpose. For investors after 40, the real danger is not market volatility. It is locking into a return profile that cannot support future needs. When structure replaces instinct, investing becomes less reactive and more effective. The result is not guaranteed outcomes, but a far higher probability of meeting long-term financial goals with flexibility and control.